Well, so my big unified theory on social media is I'm very bearish
Yes.
on the big platforms having a long future.
You are.
I think the moment of 3 or 4 major platforms is not going to last. Right. So I don't know. Okay. This is just perspective, right? So you can start shorting these stocks on my, don't tell
This is not financial advice.
Yeah. Don't do Robinhood. So here's, I think the big mistake the major platforms made is when they took out the network effect advantage, right? So the original pitch, especially of something like Facebook or Instagram, was the people you know are on here, right? So like what you use this for is you can connect to people that you already know. This is what makes the network useful. So therefore the value of our network grows quadratically with the number of users, and therefore it's such a head start that there's no way that someone else can catch up. But when they shifted, and when Facebook took the lead of say we're going to shift towards a newsfeed model, they basically said we're going to try to in the moment get more data and get more likes. Like what we're going to go towards is actually just seeing interesting stuff, like seeing diverting information. So people took this social internet impulse to connect to people digitally to other tools like group text messages and WhatsApp and stuff like this, right? So you don't think about these tools as, oh, this is where I connect with people. Once it's just a feed that's kind of interesting, now you're competing with everything else that can produce interesting content that's diverting. And I think that is a much fiercer competition because now, for example, you're going up against podcast, right? I mean, like, okay, I guess, the Twitter feed is interesting right now, but also a podcast is interesting or something else could be interesting too. I think it's a much fiercer competition when there's no more network effects, right? And so my sense is we're going to see a fragmentation into what I call long tail social media, where if I don't need everyone I know to be on a platform, then why not have 3 or 4 bespoke platforms I use where it's 1,000 people and we're all interested in, whatever, AI or comedy. And we've perfected this interface and maybe it's like Clubhouse, it's audio or something. And we all pay $2 so we don't have to worry about attention harvesting. And that's going to be wildly more entertaining. Like, I mean, I'm thinking about comedians on Twitter. It's not the best internet possible format for them expressing themselves and being interesting. That you have all these comedians that are trying to like, well, I can do like little clips and little whatever. Like, I don't know if there was a long tail social media. This is where the comedians are, and there's podcasts and the comedians are on podcasts now. So this is my thought is that there's really no strong advantage to having one large platform that everyone is on if all you're getting from it is I now have different options for diversion and like uplifting and aspirational or whatever types of entertainment. That whole thing could fragment. And I think the glue that was holding together was network effects. And I don't think they realized that when network effects have been destabilized, they don't have the centrifugal force anymore. And they're spinning faster and faster. But is a Twitter feed really that much more interesting than all of these streaming services? Is it really that much more interesting than Clubhouse? Is it that much more interesting than podcast? I feel like they don't realize how unstable their ground actually is.
Yeah, that's fascinating. But the thing that makes Twitter and Facebook work, I mean, the newsfeed, you're exactly right. Like you can just duplicate the news. Like if it's not the social network and it's the newsfeed, then why not have multiple different feeds that are better at satisfying you? There's a dopamine gamification that they've figured out.
Yeah.
So you have to, whatever you create, you have to at least provide some pleasure in that same gamification kind of way. It doesn't have to do with scale of large social networks, but I mean, I guess you're implying that you should be able to design that kind of mechanism in other forms.
Or people are turning on that gamification. I mean, so people are getting wise to it and are getting uncomfortable about it, right? So if I'm offering something, these exist
like
out
sugar.
Here.
People realize sugar is bad for you.
Sugar's
They're going to
great.
stop eating it.
Drinking a lot's great too, but it also after a while you realize there's problems. So some of the long tail social media networks that are out there that I've looked at, they offer usually like a deeper sense of connection. Like it's usually interesting people that you share some affinity and you have these carefully cultivated. I wrote this New Yorker piece a couple of years ago about the indie social media movement that really got into some of these different technologies, but I think the technologies are a distraction. We focus too much on, Mastodon versus, whatever, like forget, or Discord. Like actually, let's forget the protocols right now. It's the idea of, okay, and there's a lot of these long tail social media groups, what people are getting out of it, which I think can outweigh the dopamine gamification, is strong connection and motivation. Like you're in a group with other guys that are all trying to be, better dads or something like this. And you talk to them on a regular basis and you're sharing your stories and there's interesting talks. And That's a powerful thing too.
One interesting thing about scale of Twitter is you have these viral spread of information. So sort of Twitter has become a newsmaker in itself.
Yeah, I think it's the problem.
Well, yes, but I wonder what replaces that, because then you immediately
Reporting?
well, no,
Reporters would have to do some work again. I don't know.
no. The problem with reporters and journalism is that they're intermediary. They have control. I mean, this is the problem in Russia currently. Is that you have it creates a shield between the people and the news. The interesting thing and the powerful thing about Twitter is that the news originates from the individual that's creating the news. Like you have the president of the United States, the former president of the United States on Twitter creating news. You have Elon Musk creating news. You have people announcing stuff on Twitter as opposed to talking to a journalist. And that feels much more genuine, and it feels very powerful. But actually, coming to realize it doesn't need the social network. You can just put that announcement on a YouTube type thing.
This is what I'm thinking. Right. So this is my point about that, because that's right. The democratizing power of the internet is fantastic. I mean, I'm an old school internet nerd, a guy that was, telnetting in the servers and gophering before the World Wide Web was around, right? So I'm a huge internet booster, and that's one of its big power. But when you put everything on Twitter, I think the fact that you've taken you homogenized everything, right? So everything looks the same, moves with the same low friction, is very difficult. You have no what I call distributed curation, right? The only curation that really happens, there's a little bit with likes and also the algorithm. But if you look back to pre-Web 2.0 or early Web 2.0, when a lot of this was happening, let's say on blogs where people owned their own servers and you had your different blogs, there was this distributed curation that happened where in order for your blog to get on people's radar, and this had nothing to do with any gatekeepers or legacy media, it was over time you got more links and people respected you and you would hear about this blog over here. And there's this whole distributed curation and filtering going on. So if you think like the 2004 presidential election, most of the information people are getting from the internet was one of the first big internet news driven elections was from, you had like the Daily Kos and Drudge, but there was like blogs that were out there. And this was back, Ezra Klein was just running a blog out of his, a dorm room at this point. Right. And you would, in a distributed fashion, gain credibility because, people have paid it. It's very hard to get people to pay attention to your blog. They're paying attention. I get linked to this kid Ezra or whatever. It seems to be really sharp. And now people are noticing it. And now you have a distributed curation that solves a lot of the problems we see when you have a completely homogenized low friction environment like Friction, where, Twitter, where any random conspiracy theory or whatever that people like can just shoot through and spread. Whereas if you're starting a blog to try to push QAnon or something like that, it's probably going to be a really weird looking blog and you're gonna have a hard time. Like, it's just never going to show up on people's radar. Right. I mean,
so everything you've said up until the very last statement, I would agree with.
This is a topic I don't know a ton about, I guess.
So
QAnon.
There's I think forget QAnon.
We can
but QAnon is QAnon could be that. I also don't know. I should know more. I apologize. I don't know more. I mean, that's a power and the downside. You can have, Hitler could have a blog today, and he would have potentially a very large following if he's charismatic, if he's has, is good with words, is able to express the ideas, whatever. Maybe he's able to channel the frustration, the anger that people have about a certain thing. And so I think that's the power of blogs, but it's also the limitation. But we're not trying to solve that.
You can't solve that.
The fundamental problem you're saying is not the problem. Your thesis is that there's nothing special about large scale social networks that guarantees that they will keep existing.
And it's important to remember for a lot of the older generation of internet activists, so the people who were very pro internet in the early days, they were completely flabbergasted by the rise of these platforms. Say, why would you take the internet and then build your own version of the internet where you own all the servers? And we built this whole the whole thing. We had open protocols. Everyone anywhere in the world can use the same protocols. Your machine can talk to any other machine. It's the most democratic communication system that's ever been built. And then these companies came along and said, we're going to build our own. We'll just own all the servers and put them in buildings that we own. And the internet will just be the first mile just to get you into our private internet where we owned the whole thing. It went completely against the entire motivation of the internet was like, yes, it's not going to be one person owns all the servers and you pay to access them. It's any one server that they own can talk to anyone else's server because we all agree on a standard set of protocols. And so the old guard of pro internet people never understood this move towards let's build private versions of the internet. We'll build 3 or 4 private internets, and that's what we'll all use. It was the opposite, basically.
Well, it's funny enough, I don't know if you follow, but Jack Dorsey is also is a proponent and is helping to create fully distributed versions of Twitter, essentially a thing that would potentially destroy Twitter.
Yeah.
But I think there might be financial like business cases to be made there. I'm not sure, but that seems to be another alternative as opposed to creating a bunch of like the long tail, creating like the ultimate long tail of like fully distributed.
Yeah, which is
what the internet is.
But that's sort of when I'm thinking about long tail social media, I'm thinking it's like the tech's not so important. Like there's groups out there, right? I know where the tech they use to actually implement their digital only social group, whatever, they might use Slack, they might use some combination of Zoom, or it doesn't matter. I think in the tech world, we want to build the beautiful protocol that, okay, everyone's going to use as just a federated server protocol in which we've worked out X, Y, and Z, and no one understands it because then the engineers need it all to make, I get it because I'm a nerd like this. Like, okay, every standard has to fit with everything else and no one understands what's going on. Meanwhile, you have this group of bike enthusiasts that are like, yeah, we'll just jump on a Zoom and have some Slack and put up a blog. The tech doesn't really matter. Like we built the world with our own curation, our own rules, our own sort of social ecosystem that's generating a lot of value. I mean, I don't know if it'll happen. There's a lot of money at stake with obviously these large, but I just think I mean, look how quickly Americans left Facebook, right? I mean, Facebook was savvy to buy other properties and to diversify, right? But how quick did that take for just standard Facebook newsfeed? Everyone under the age of something were using it and no one under a certain age is using it now. It took like 4 years. I mean, this stuff is really...
I believe people can leave Facebook overnight.
Yeah.
Like I think Facebook hasn't actually messed up enough to, there's 2 things. They haven't messed up enough for people to really leave aggressively, and there's no good alternative for them to leave. I think if good alternatives pop up, it would just immediately happen.
The stuff is a lot more culturally fragile, I think. I mean, Twitter's having a moment because it was feeding a certain type of, I mean, there's a lot of anxieties that was in the sort of political sphere anyways that Twitter was working with. But its moment could go too as well. I mean, it's a really arbitrary thing, short little things. And I read a Wired article about this earlier in the pandemic. Like, this is crazy that the way that we're trying to communicate information about the pandemic is all these weird arbitrary rules where people are screenshotting pictures of articles that are part of a tweet thread where you say /in under it. Like, we have the technology, guys, to like really clearly convey long form information to people. Like, why do we have these? And I know it's because it's the gamified dopamine hits, but what a weird medium. There's no reason for us to have these threads that you have to find and pin with you screenshot. I mean, we have technology to communicate better using the internet. I mean, why are epidemiologists having to do tweet threads?
Well, because there's mechanisms of publishing that make it easier on Twitter. I mean, we're evolving as a species, and the internet is a very fresh thing.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of interesting to think that as opposed to Twitter, this is what Jack also complains about, is Twitter's not innovating fast enough.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like the people are innovating and thinking about their productive life faster than the platforms on which they operate can catch up.
Yeah.
And so at the point the gap grows sufficiently, they'll jump. A few innovative folks will just create an alternative, and perhaps distributed, perhaps just many little silos, and then people will jump, and then we'll just continue this kind of way.
Yeah, but see, I think like Substack, for example, what they're going to pull out of Twitter, among other things, is the audience that was, let's say, like slightly left of center, but slightly left of center, don't like Trump, uncomfortable with like postmodern critical theories made into political action, right? And they're like, yeah, Twitter, there was people on there talking about this, and it made me feel sort of heard because I was feeling a little bit like a nerd about it. But honestly, I'd probably rather subscribe to 4 subs. I'm going to have like Barry's and Andrew Sullivan's. I'll have like a Jesse Signals. Like, I'll have a few Substacks I can subscribe to. And honestly, I'm a knowledge worker who's 32 anyways, probably, that's an email all day. And so like there's an innovation that's that group, it's going to suck them off.
Which is actually a very large group.
Yeah, that's a lot of energy. And then once Trump's gone, I guess that's probably going to drove a lot of more like Trump people off Twitter. Like this stuff is fragile, I think.
But the fascinating thing to me, because I've hung out on Parler for a short amount enough to know that the interface matters. It's so fascinating, like that. Yeah. That it's not just about ideas.
Yeah.
It's about creating, like Substack too, creating a pleasant experience, addicting experience.
No, you're right. You're right about that. And it's hard. And it's why this is one of the conclusions from that indie social media article is it's just the ugliness matters. And I don't mean even just aesthetically, but just the clunkiness of the interfaces, and I don't know, to some degree, the social media companies have spent a lot of money on this, and to some degree, it's a survivorship bias.
Yeah.
Right. I think Twitter, every time I hear Jack talks about this, it seems like he's as surprised as anyone else, the way Twitter is being used. I mean, it's basically the way, they had it years ago. And then, it was like, great, it'll be statuses, right?
Yeah.
This is what I'm doing, and my friends can follow me and see it. And without really changing anything, it just happened to hit everything right. Yeah. To support this other type of interaction.
Well, there's also the JavaScript model, which Brendan Eich talked about. He just implemented JavaScript, like the crappy version of JavaScript in 10 days, threw it out there and just changed it really quickly.
Yeah.
Evolved it really quickly, and now has become, according to Stack Exchange, the most popular programming language in the world. It drives like most of the internet and even the back end, and now mobile. And so that's an argument for the kind of thing you're talking about, where like the bike club people could literally create the thing that would run most of the internet in 10 years from now. It's so there's something to that, like, as opposed to trying to get lucky or trying to think through stuff, is just to solve a particular problem,
do stuff
and then do stuff
like, keep tinkering until you love it. And
then and of course the sad thing is timing and luck matter, and that you can't really control.
That's the problem.